and the complex. And you can see the things that we saw on the slide. I'll just have this up here and develop it. Okay. I thank you all. I hope you'll be here next week, where we'll pick up the story again. Thank you. Our series of core presentations and discussions. The topic tonight is going to be, the title of it is From Jesus the Pharisee to Jesus the Messiah. Let me begin, however, with a correction of a mistake that I made last week. Was called to my attention in the drive home by my son Adam. He told me I'd made a mistake, and I asked him what it was, and he told me what it was. And I was unaware of it. I talked near the beginning about the designation BC and BCE, and that is a scholarly substitution for what is normally what one normally sees as BC and AD. And I erroneously, it's the first time that I'm aware I've ever said it, but I said that CE was Christian era and BC was before the Christian era. That's not right. BC means, BCE is before the Common Era, and CE is Common Era. I said it was religiously neutral. How can it be religiously neutral if it's Christian era? So that was, I think, my only mistake. At least, and I wasn't even aware of that. So who knows what else I said last week that was wrong. We're going to be talking about Jesus specifically this week, and then next Sunday night talking specifically about Paul, and then finally, sort of as a wrap-up, looking at the text as a whole, the New Testament as a whole from a Jewish perspective. Now, it is very important that you understand that what I'm going to be saying tonight represents a Jewish understanding, viewpoint of this person Jesus. And the same next week with Paul, and the same with the New Testament. So if what I will be saying tonight does not preach well on Sunday morning, you should not be surprised. However, I hope that it will kindle a little light, maybe even a little heat, which is fine. And then in the process, those of you that are not Jewish, and we certainly welcome you here, will get a little bit better understanding of where Jews are in this whole understanding of early Christianity, and that from a Jewish perspective, we also may be able to fill out this sometimes nebulous era in our history. The story of Jesus and Paul in the New Testament is certainly part of our history as well. And I think to our great detriment, an area that the Jewish tradition has largely ignored up until relatively recent years, and I think understandably largely ignored. And so we begin with the question, which will be the question all evening: who was Jesus, and how does he fit within the Jewish perspective? It should not come as any surprise to any of you that any Jewish perspective of Jesus does not include the statement that Jesus is the Messiah. If Jews believed that Jesus was the Messiah, in Hebrew Moshiach, anointed one, if Jews believed that Jesus was the Christ, this would be a church, and it wouldn't be a synagogue. So that end of the line shouldn't come as any surprise. If Jewish tradition then does not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus as the Christ, how is Jesus understood? And that whole prospect of finding the historical Jesus, understanding the environment, the background out of which he strides into history, is a very complicated endeavor. It's also a very nebulous endeavor. And there have been scores and scores of books written mostly in this century, but a few before that time, trying to identify the historical Jesus and place him in all kinds of different roles, from revolutionary to itinerant salesman to outright thief, and someone who is pulling the wool over the community's eyes. From very positive to very negative. From a religious leader to a revolutionary leader to a political leader to a social action leader. All are different perspectives that have been published and to one extent or another have received some press. My perspective, and the one that I will pursue, and one that I think is probably most jarring to Christian audiences, is that Jesus was a Pharisee coming out of Pharisaic Judaism and moving to the periphery, to the fringes of the Pharisaic movement. And the reason that statement, I believe, is jarring to, at least to non-Jews, is that most of the confrontations, if not all, well, not all, but most, the vast majority of the confrontations that Jesus has with Jews in the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and particularly with John, come with Pharisees. Though in John they're not called Pharisees, they're just called Jews. But if you look at the moments in these three synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you look at the moments that Jesus is in conflict, in argument, in confrontation with Jewish leaders, they're Pharisees. And so what kind of sense does it make to say that Jesus was a Pharisee? It would clearly, I would think, make more sense to say he was not a Pharisee and arguing against their perspective. What I'm going to try and demonstrate this evening, using New Testament text, is that indeed he was a Pharisee, and was to a certain extent at odds with Pharisaic Judaism, but not very much. And that it is my belief that whenever we see a conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, it is not so much a conflict in Jesus' day, but it's a conflict. It is a reflection of a conflict in the gospel writer's day, rather than an actuality in Jesus' day. That I can't prove, although there are plenty of other scholars that would support the same idea. But that's at the end of the story. If Jesus was a Pharisee, then we need to understand what Pharisees were. And in order to do that, we have to precede Jesus by almost 500 years. And we're going to, and I will go through this, I hope, relatively quickly. If in this or in anything that we're talking about that you have a question, please stop me. Please question. I don't want you to be confused. I don't want you to be upset that I'm bulldozing my way through history or anything else. Please stop me. Please give me the chance to explain myself, because if you leave confused, that's not doing any of us any good, and I want you to understand. You don't have to agree with what I'm saying, but I want you to understand what I'm saying. And we have to begin in the middle of the 6th century BCE. In the year 586, the Babylonian army sweeps down out of the north and destroys Jerusalem, particularly the temple in Jerusalem, and exiles its leadership. And with the destruction of the temple, with the elimination of the temple and the cult and the entire worship structure that was centered in Jerusalem and at the temple and with the priests, with the destruction of all that, there is a vacuum that is formed within the relationship between the people and God. The temple was God's home, God's presence was there, the Ark of the Covenant was there, until sometime before the destruction. It wasn't there when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. But God's presence was focused in the temple. This was God's home. And the fact that the temple is destroyed means that God doesn't have a home. What does it say about our belief in an almighty, omnipotent God? And there is no place for the people to focus their worship, their attention, or their religious selves. There is no place for communion. There's no place for the people to touch God. And with the exile of the leaders to Babylon, in Babylon a new process begins. And it begins, I think, very slowly. And it begins with leaders discussing this whole issue and saying to themselves, surely this isn't the end of Judaism. If we can only go back into God's revelation, Torah, first 5 books of Scripture, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. If we can only go back into Torah, focus in on Torah, perhaps the answer to our dilemma will be found there. And I believe that in the study circles in Babylon, a new process began. A process in which the scholars said to themselves, God has a message here. We've got to concentrate on the text in order to find it. And even though we can't worship at the temple because we're in Babylon and the temple's gone anyway, we can reproduce some of what happened at the temple here in our homes. And so our dinner table can be the altar. And the food that we eat, we can treat it as if it was the grain and meat offerings that were brought to the temple. And we can give thanks to God before we eat in the same way that we gave thanks to God before we brought the offerings to the temple. And even though the temple is gone, we can still celebrate the Sabbath. We can preserve the Sabbath and the rest and the sense of community that is gendered by the Sabbath. We can preserve that here in Babylon, and we don't need the temple. And so based on the focus of family and Shabbat and the Sabbath, a new process begins in Babylon that is just beginning to germinate when Babylon falls to King Cyrus of Persia, about 530 BCE, and King Cyrus starts to send the Jews back down to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Now, most of the Jews that are in Babylon don't leave. King Cyrus says, I want you to go back and build the temple. I'll give you troops for protection. I'll give you cash. I'll give you whatever you want. I want you to build the temple. And you would think, particularly after you read Lamentations, and how terrible it was that the temple is gone, and Psalm 172 or whatever it is, by the waters of Babylon, we hung up our harps, and our tormentors asked us to sing songs of the temple. You know, this gut-wrenching psalm of desolation and misery. You would think that when Cyrus said, please go, I'll help you, they would have rushed to return to Jerusalem, but they didn't go. The vast majority stayed in Babylon. In fact, the leaders stayed in Babylon. Now, what conclusion can we draw?
They liked it.
They liked it. Right. There was something going on in Babylon, a freedom, perhaps, the ability to create, a comfort, maybe even luxury, certainly freedom, that prompted the leaders to stay. In fact, there were several waves of Jews that left Babylon going down to Jerusalem. Never the leadership. And finally, Persia sent Ezra and Nehemiah, which is at the end of Hebrew Scripture, to go and really do a job because they hadn't been so successful before.
Why would Cyrus take this interest in this cast-off people?
Cyrus was not interested in the Jews. Cyrus was interested in a buffer state between his Persian Empire and Egypt. And he figured that if the Jews were happy in Judea, he wouldn't have to have as many troops down there in case Egypt came up, because the Jews would fight for him. And so it was purely a political, self-motivated move. He really didn't care about the Jews that I'm aware of. But interestingly, there were a lot of Jews, and we have records of the time, that thought that Cyrus was the Messiah. Because he said that you should go back, I'll help you build the temple, of course under the Persian flag. But there were Jews that thought he was the Messiah. And anyway.
Could it be also that they enjoy the new more freely expressed religious ideas?
In Babylon.
In a sense, you have a reform religion here.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons that I think that they wanted to stay in Babylon was that they had become religious leaders. When the temple is reestablished in Jerusalem, who are the religious leaders? The priests, the Levites. And this scholar group, which was not Levites, and there may have been some in there, but it wasn't a Levitical group. They would be in competition with the restored priesthood. And I'm sure that that was part of it as well. And so a group comes, the scholarship that is up in Babylon filters its way down into Judea, so that 400 years later, let's say around the year 150, we have an organized scholarly group that has its own identity in Judea. And this scholarly organized group has removed itself from the priesthood and its authority. And this scholarly organized group says, it's true that we need to bring offerings to the temple. Thanksgiving offerings, praise offerings, holiday offerings, atonement offerings. We have to do all these things at the temple. But we are the ones that hold in our hands how you live your lives. Because we have developed the true commentary to the Torah that explains the Torah. Now, this group of scholars said, for instance, you all know, to the Jews of Judea, you all know about this group that is called the Big Ten. Not in basketball. The Big Ten Commandments. You know about these laws. But let me tell you something. They're not laws. They're not laws. You know, we read in the Ten Commandments, you will not murder. Well, that's not a law. Why?
When was the Torah not canonized but recognized?
Canonized 440 with Ezra. Ezra brings with him a copy of written Torah from Babylon. It's the first example of the written law. And so in the next 300 years, this group that's in Judea is percolating around this written copy of the text. So they do have a written copy of the text. And the text says you will not murder. And the priests over in the temple say that's a law. And this group of scholars says it's not a law. I'm still asking you, why isn't it a law?
What's murder?
What's murder? It's a value. But if I'm conscripted into the army and told to go kill an enemy soldier, that's premeditated, it's violent, I kill him. Is that murder? No, it's not murder. If somebody is attacking my wife with a baseball bat, and I pull out a shotgun and blow him away, is that murder? No, that's not murder. It's not quite self-defense, but it's certainly justifiable homicide in our courts, and in their courts too. So the fact that Exodus, and then repeated again in Deuteronomy, says you will not murder is an interesting value, but it is not specific. It is equivalent to saying you can drive on Interstate 70 as fast as you want as long as it's safe. In other words, don't speed. So you're pulled over going 90 miles an hour, and the cop says you were speeding. You said, no, I wasn't. I had the car totally under control. I had no problem. A danger to no one. I wasn't doing anything wrong.
Still get a ticket.
Only because there is a law that says that limits what the speed should be. Only because of that. But a statement that says you will not murder is not a law. It's a value. Honor your mother and father that your days may be long on the earth. Is that a law? No. Because every one of us has a different understanding of honoring your parents. And a lot of it will be dependent on what you think about your parents. And how you were brought up. And what's happening to your parents right now. Honoring your parents is a value. Resting on the Sabbath is a value. It is not a law. Now, this group of scholars have been working with Torah for a long time, ever since Babylon. And they have developed a commentary that they believe has come from God. A commentary that has come from God. And they are able to tell you what murder is, what honoring your parents consists of, and what you should do and not do on the Sabbath. And the source of their deliberation, the source of their knowledge, is God. Because they said, when God met Moses at Sinai in the desert, he gave Moses two Torahs, two laws, one written and one oral. The written one is the one Ezra brought in back with him from Babylonia, the first 5 books of Scripture. But there was an oral law that God told Moses. And Moses told Joshua. And Joshua told the elders. And the elders told the heads of the tribes. And on and on and on. Till it comes to these scholarly groups who were discussing what it means to murder. And the source of their authority, they say, is God, who has protected this transmission ever since Sinai. Now, this group of scholars who are proclaiming a double law, an oral law and a written law, are in contradiction to the priests, who over at the temple are saying, second law, oral law, unwritten law, ridiculous. Where do you see that written? Where do you see any mention of an oral law? No place. They're just trying to take our leadership away from us. And so the priests at the temple are very upset that this scholarly group has been generating these ideas as if it were God's law. And this scholarly group is absolutely, totally convinced that they are transmitting what God wanted them to know. And in its oral form, it becomes flexible. In its oral form, it can be adaptable to each succeeding generation. And in its oral form, it can move from place to place and be effective under differing conditions. Now, this scholarly group that is maintaining this double revelation comes to be called, around the year 150 BCE, 150 years before Jesus, this group comes to be called the Pharisees. Their Hebrew name is Parushim.
What were the Sadducees doing during this time without a temple and...
In 150, there's a temple.
No, but I mean, was the temple reestablished at when?
Close to the year 500, a little bit before.
So they only had about 50 years without a temple?
Mm-hmm. Cyrus orders them back 50 years after the destruction of the temple. Now they come back. The first attempt to rebuild the temple is very minor, very small, very modest. That's why succeeding generations, particularly Ezra and Nehemiah, mostly Nehemiah, try to make the temple a little bit bigger, make it more prestigious. It's nothing like Solomon's time. But it is there. It is there under Persian insistence. And so there's only a 50-year span that the Pharisees are out of work. Thank you. Sadducees are out of work. You got it correctly. There's only 50 years that the Sadducees are out of work. Now, the Pharisees are Parushim. They're separatists. I don't know if they call themselves that or the Sadducees on the other side of town call them that. The Sadducees, I mentioned last week, the Hebrew is Zadokim, from the chief priest Zadok, who was the first priest that Solomon appointed when Solomon's temple was established quite a long time before that. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees are at each other.
The Torah is a product then of the oral and the written?
No, the written Torah comes from Ezra in the year, around the year 440, 450 BCE. He presents it. The oral law is...
He has presented the canonization at that time.
It is canonized, yes. He comes with the law, and with his presentation, it is accepted as final, as canon.
What text did he have?
Exactly what you have, except you have it in English. But the Hebrew Torah, a few little things, you know, a letter here, a letter there. But if Ezra, put it another way, if Ezra were to go into that ark and take out the Torah scroll that's in that ark, he would know exactly what it is. And he would have no problems with what it says. So for 2,500 years, almost, Torah has been set. A few things here and there. Final consonants, a word maybe switched around, but for the most part, without deviation. The rest of Hebrew Scripture is canonized at a later time, in stages. The Torah is set in the 5th century BCE.
So with that, there's a difference between oral tradition, one of the ways of describing how the Scripture passed so many generations before it was written down, and then the written law as opposed to the oral law.
You lost me.
Okay. With like some of the Torah, say Leviticus, Numbers, where it was passed down generation to generation by being told.
Right.
That's different than talking about the oral law.
Yes.
Which is the second law that
Yes.
the Pharisees came up with.
Right.
Okay.
The oral tradition is a commentary on Leviticus and Numbers and Genesis and Exodus and Deuteronomy. It explains how the things that are supposed to be done are supposed to be done. So, for instance, under the discussion about the Sabbath, you're not supposed to labor on the Sabbath. You're only supposed to rest. they will list 39 categories of labor. They'll list, this is what it means by labor. And under murder, it will talk about, in our modern code, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, justifiable homicide, self-defense, and going to war. It will talk about those things, none of which is in Scripture. None of it's in Torah.
I wonder if you worded it oral tradition versus oral transmission. The transmission of the Torah prior to its canonization
I don't
and
even want
being
to-
written has to be oral.
Yeah, it has to be oral, and I don't want to deal with that because we have no idea what it was. I assume that what Ezra brought to them was familiar to them. Otherwise, they never would have accepted it. If what Ezra brought in writing wasn't what they had heard before, they would have rebelled. So Ezra brought a written text of what they already knew that was always transmitted orally before. But I am, from a Pharisee point of view, Ezra's got written law. They'll never talk about that in any oral form. It'll always be a written form, because that's how God gave it to Moses, they would say. So according to the Pharisees, it was always written. We look back on history and understand that before Ezra, it wasn't written. But the Pharisees said it was always written. Okay?
How did they account for the writing of a history prior to the history being formed? That is, Deuteronomy includes the history of Moses, which Moses, in theory, is then transmitting. So he's transmitting before the fact things that he will enact.
That is indeed a problem, and the Pharisees answered no differently than any fundamentalist Jew or fundamentalist Christian would say today, that either God added the last chapter himself or Moses knew.
These are the alleged.
If Torah is divine, Torah is divine. If Torah is perfect, Torah is perfect. If Moses wrote it, Moses wrote it. And your kind of question is just sort of thrown off as saying you're trying to be cute. But that's how a fundamental tradition will respond. If Moses wrote it, Moses wrote it. And your question, which is immediately logical to me, I have more questions than that. I mean, if we get into the question of could Moses have written Torah, my response is absolutely not. And I can give you a whole list of reasons and things to struggle with. And the response from the traditional, from the fundamental Jews and Christians, or Muslims, would be in effect the same to all of my questions, just like yours. That would turn it into a non-question.
Was writing accorded at this particular time?
Sure.
Written? Everything?
I don't know about everything, but there certainly is writing before Hebrew. And Hebrew, too. But that's not a question for us. I mean, that's a question for people involved in the history of writing. I don't care about that. It's enough for me to say that the Pharisees said the Torah was written down and Torah was oral. And that the Sadducees said Torah was only written. Well, we could spend a long time talking about that, but then we'll never get to Jesus. Okay. The Pharisees, in addition to this idea of an oral tradition, the Pharisees proclaimed three other distinguishing characteristics, distinguishing philosophical statements. The first one, and probably the most serious, at least to the Sadducees, was this idea of the second law. That was very serious. But along with that, they said three more things. The first was that someday soon there would be a Moshiach, a Messiah. Moshiach means anointed one. Someday soon there would be a Messiah. Now the priests had been running up against people who were calling for a Messiah for the last 500-600 years. And they were getting pretty tired of Jeremiah and Micah and Hosea and all that generation of prophets saying, what you're doing at the temple is insufficient. You know, you've got to do justice and love righteousness and all this stuff. And the prophets had been calling for a Messiah like David, another David, that would drive out the enemy, that would restore peace to the land, that would unite the people, and restore proper worship at the temple. Prophets have been saying that for a long time. And up until the Pharisees, there was about a 300-year lull in which nobody was talking about a Messiah. Because once the temple is gone, All of the prophets that were talking about the Messiah just shut up. You hear nothing from them anymore. And so the Pharisees now are bringing this up again. There'll be a Messiah. Sadducees say, we thought we'd done with that. We don't want to hear about it anymore. The Pharisees said, but this is a different Messiah. It's not, the Messiah you're used to hearing about will be just like King David, a military hero, a political hero, a charismatic leader, drive out the enemy, restore peace, bring the people together. No. This Messiah, they said, this Moshiach, they said, will have powers like Moses had. Moses didn't have powers. God had power and channeled him through Moses. But like Moses could split the sea, and Moses could bring the plagues, and Moses could draw water from the rock, this Moshiach would also have those kinds of supernatural powers. And with these supernatural powers, he wouldn't just drive away the enemy, he will eliminate evil. The Pharisees said the Moshiach will eliminate evil, all evil. And when what they call the Yamot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah come, there will be no more evil. All of us will have, of course we're not evil, all of us will have all the food we'll need, we won't have to labor anymore, it'll be a wonderful time. And in addition, and this is the third thing, innovation that they said, in addition, the Pharisees said there will be resurrection of the righteous. All righteous people will be resurrected. Their bodies will rise from the ground, be transported to Jerusalem, and they will join us in this new world here on earth. A world without evil, a world without labor, a world with a proper cult at the temple, proper worshiping at the temple. And so the Pharisees brought the oral law, they brought the idea of resurrection, they brought the idea of the Moshiach. What was the fourth one? Oh yeah, and the fourth one I sort of mentioned is that idea of the coming world, the Olam Haba, a new world. Now this is a new idea. The prophets before never talked about a changing world. Talking about a nice world, like David had. But the Pharisees are talking about a changed world in which the laws of nature are upended. Clearly, if there's resurrection, the laws of nature have been upended. If evil doesn't exist at all, if there is food for all of us without labor, then the natural laws have been upended. And this Olam Haba, which means the coming world, or the world to come, will be here with us. But the laws will be changed. All four of those are revolutionary ideas from the Pharisees, from the Sadducean point of view. All quite revolutionary. All of which are proclaimed by Jesus. All of which. Moshiach, the changed world, the oral law, which I'll demonstrate, and what he calls the kingdom. The kingdom is close at hand, he says. The kingdom is close at hand. Okay. What I want to demonstrate are two things at once. The first, that Jesus speaks completely out of Pharisaic tradition. What he says is out of Pharisaic tradition. And then he goes a step beyond. His arguments about Jewish tradition, are set firmly within the Pharisaic camp. And one good example of it, one that we won't look at, but one really good example of it is he has an argument about resurrection. Now it's interesting, this is the only argument that I'm aware of offhand that he has with only the Sadducees. It specifically says the Sadducees, I believe in Matthew. He has an argument about resurrection. And the Sadducean leader comes up to Jesus, and the Sadducean leader says, of course they don't believe in resurrection, he says, look, you say resurrection? Well, what happens if I get married, and my wife dies, I get married again, my wife dies, I get married again? In the next world, who's my wife? Well, that's a good question. And Jesus' response is a really good Pharisaic answer. What difference does it make? We're all going to be together. We're not going to have the kind of relations with each other that we have here. And we'll all be together as brothers and sisters. Well, that's what the Pharisees would have said too. But it's interesting that it's the Sadducees that argue with him, and not the Pharisees. Although in other instances, it's the Pharisees that argue. The quotes that we're going to be looking at, I'm going to be looking at them in Mark. Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, chronologically. And if you have Bibles with notes in it that tell you where the other quotes are coming from, you can find it in the other quotes, and that'll be fine. But for the most part, I'm only going to be dealing with Mark. Now, the point that I'm going to make is this. One of the things that marks Jesus' presentations is that he speaks with an authority even beyond the Pharisees. When he talks about this is the way, when he talks in terms of commentary, he's making commentary on the law. He is saying, this is what it really means. That's Pharisaic. The Sadducees would never have said that. The Sadducees would have said, this is the law. Jesus says, this is the law, now I'll tell you what it means. Well, that's coming out of Pharisaic Judaism. But he always takes it a step beyond. And when I said that he goes to the fringes, to the periphery of the Pharisees, he takes the idea of the Pharisaic commentary, that whole idea of oral tradition, of oral law and commentary, and he takes it to an extreme. He speaks with an unparalleled authority. When the Pharisees say, this is what murder means, who is the authority? When the Pharisees say it, who's the authority?
God.
God. How so? All the way back to Moses. Moses to Joshua, down to us. When the Pharisees say, what does murder mean? And somebody says who? They say, says God. When Jesus makes a statement, who is the authority?
He is.
No, Jesus is. He says he is. We'll look at it. We'll look in Mark 11:28. We'll start there. Mark chapter 11, verse 28. Now these, I have the parallel quotes, but we're not going to. You can look it up yourself. They're pretty much the same. I'm not going to deal with John at all. Just Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three synoptic Gospels. 11:20. We'll start with 27. This translation is New International. I only use it because it's small. I can carry it easily. They arrived again in Jerusalem, and while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders, teachers of the law and elders we read as Pharisees, came to him. By what authority are you doing these things? They asked. Who gave you the authority to do this? Jesus replied, I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. John's baptism, was it from heaven or from men? Tell me. And they discussed it among themselves, and they said, if you say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say from men, they feared the people, for everyone held that John really was a prophet. And so they answered Jesus, we don't know. And Jesus said, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. Jesus becomes the authority. Again in Mark 8:35, we'll go back a little bit. Start in 34. Then he called to the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. For what good is it that a man gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the host of angels. Anyone who disagrees with me will be in disagreement with the Son of Man, whatever that means, in the days to come. We may talk about that. Again, he becomes an authority above authorities. I mentioned before the Pharisees listed 39 categories of labor. Let's look at how Jesus deals with that in Mark 2:23. Now, by this time, by the year 30, let's say, 30 CE, the Pharisees were clearly the popular movement among the people. The Pharisees had quite specifically proclaimed what labor was and was not on the Sabbath. So we find in 2:23, one Sabbath Jesus was going through the grain fields as his disciples walked along, and they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, now what the Pharisees were doing in this grain field on Sabbath, I don't know, but guarding it, I guess. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" The Pharisees said that plucking grain, which is labor, what farmers do during the week, that's labor. He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, the showbread that was in the temple, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions. And then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Jesus presents his interpretation of what Sabbath law is above the Pharisees. He becomes an authority beyond the Pharisees. Mark 7:14. We'll deal with dietary laws. 7:14. We're going to look at these again in a little different way, but serve the purpose here. 7:14. The setting here is, I believe he's eating with unclean hands. And the Pharisees are very upset about that because it violates Pharisaic law. Again, Jesus, this is 7:14. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him." Pharisees must have dropped over dead. "Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean." And then, of course, his disciples don't understand it. But he is declaring that the Pharisaic dietary laws regarding everything from washing your hands to eating forbidden foods are now void. On what authority can he do this? That even violates Torah. That even violates Leviticus. He is clearly setting himself up above, as a legal authority, above Pharisaic law. And yet the whole foundation for his doing it has to be Pharisaic. The whole basis of it is, I understand what these laws mean, and therefore I am declaring what is truth, exactly as the Pharisees had done before. He does the same thing with divorce. He speaks as an authoritative person. He calls himself indeed the law of the Sabbath. There are other instances that I'll just mention. I can give you quotes in other places. He refuses to insist that his disciples fast, though the Pharisaic law demands it. Is washing his hands. He eats with sinners. He eschews ritual purification. He eats places where the Pharisees absolutely would say one is forbidden to go. And so he leaves us, Jesus leaves us here with a paradox. He overthrows Pharisaic law, and yet he acknowledges the tradition of the Pharisees. I mean, it's not as if he's ignoring the Pharisees. Of course, we have to go to Matthew to do this, but we'll look at two places in Matthew. 5:17. We'll leave Mark and go to the book before. Matthew 5:17. Famous quote. Jesus says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen, like the cross and the T or the dot of the I, is what he's referring to, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks even the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven." And he goes on. On the one hand, he clearly, at least here in Matthew, he clearly acknowledges the authority of the Pharisees, yet in the same book, Matthew 16:12, 16:12, he has a disagreement with his disciples. Don't understand what he's talking about. He's talking about the leaven of the Pharisees, and they think he's talking about bread. But in verse 12, in 15:12, then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. How can this be? On the one hand, he says the Pharisaic law is there, it is perfect, he's fulfilling it. On the other hand, in the same book anyway, he's talking about they're supposed to disregard the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So what? So which is it? How can we reconcile that he is speaking from their authority and yet their authority is null and void? He also transcends the written Torah. Let's go with Matthew 5:17. That same quote in which talking about the law and the prophets that we just mentioned, not a single dot will pass away until it's fulfilled. And then Matthew 24:35. Or 34. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. His words, his interpretation, become the authority. How can Torah be absolute, firm? How can the Pharisees' interpretation be absolute and firm? And Jesus supersede them? That's a serious problem. It seems to me there's only one way to reconcile that. Under what circumstances would the laws of Torah and the deliberations of the Pharisees no longer be true, even though they're true? Under what circumstance?
If he's Messiah.
Not quite. What's the purpose of the laws of Torah? What's the purpose of the decisions, the laws of the Pharisees? What's their purpose? To guidelines. Why? Why do we need guidelines?
For way of life.
Why? No, there's no heaven here. Why?
To show us where we're wrong.
Why? Come on, get to the bedrock. Why? Why should we be instructed to be better people?
God's will.
No. Why? There's got to be a reason for it. I mean, this is not hard.
We live one with another.
To make this a better world. We're supposed to be better people to make this a better world. God gives us laws to live by to make this a better world. Under what possible circumstances mightn't we not need these laws anymore? If it was a perfect world. I said it was simple. Jesus' message is, yes, the Pharisees are correct. Yes, Torah is correct. They have brought us to this place. And now, the kingdom, as he calls it, the kingdom is at hand. And we no longer need those laws. Yes, they're correct, but we no longer need them. In order for Jesus to say, the world is changed, or is about, he doesn't say it's changed, it's about to be changed. In order for Jesus to declare that this is a new world, he has to be speaking from a Pharisaic perspective. The Pharisees who said there would be a new world with the arrival of the Moshiach, and if we attribute to Jesus the truth of resurrection, that puts him again in the Pharisaic camp. And on what basis, and if he is applauding what the Pharisees are saying, particularly in the idea of resurrection, as well as the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, again, speaking again from a Pharisaic perspective, from that idea of oral tradition. He has to be speaking from the Pharisee point of view. But he has moved beyond the Pharisee point of view by declaring himself as an authority. When Jesus says, "But I say to you," he has removed himself from Pharisaic Judaism. Because Pharisaic Judaism would say, tradition tells us, or God told us, or as we learned from Moses.
Is this a startling thing for someone in the Pharisee sect to take a stand aside from other scholars of his time? I mean, doesn't that how the whole thing developed in the first place?
I think it would have been unusual. I don't know if it would have been startling. Surely there were people who took that kind of authoritative stance and said, "I say to you." We don't have records of it in rabbinic literature. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. The fact that it wasn't too startling, I think, is to a certain degree demonstrated that he has a lot of followers. If it was real startling, they probably would have thought he was crazy. So, yes, he is set apart from the Pharisees. But everything that he's saying is recognizable by the Pharisees. And if, as a Pharisee, you say there will be resurrection, the coming of a new world, the oral tradition is correct, and the Messiah is coming, and Jesus says all these things and says, to a certain extent, "I am it," you're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, if you're a Pharisee, why not? I mean, it would fit in. He's a little radical, to be sure, but he would fit in. Now, beyond Jesus as placing himself above the law, there's one other innovation that he brings. In reference to God, he uses the term Abba. Now, Abba is translated as father, but that's not right. Abba is a Hebrew word. And it's translated in your Bibles, your English Bibles, as father. The word for father is Av. Av. Abba doesn't mean father. It means dad in English. Dad.
What's the difference?
Oh, I think there's a big difference.
Would that be more slang in Hebrew?
No, it's not slang.
Or
It's familiar, exactly. If I led services upstairs and said, "Thank you, Dad, for all that you've given us this week," my congregation would platz. You don't have that kind of a relationship with God. God is father, or today maybe parent. There is a sense of reverence. One does not say dad, and I guarantee you in your churches, your preachers don't start out their prayers by talking about dad.
Father as a priestly function in that context, or
Are you putting it into Catholicism?
no? The word Abba, like a literally father or priestly type father.
Okay. Well, let me say what I think you're saying, Mark.
All right.
Because then it's correct. The priests in this time were the avenue through which the people had communion with God. God, the great protector parent. For Jesus to say pray to God directly is not so unusual. Because the Pharisees said, yeah, you do got to go to the priest to do the ritual and all of that, but you can have communion with God on your own. That's good Pharisee theology. He takes it a step further in saying, Dad, you follow me, you can get even closer to God than you can with even the Pharisees.
Now that had to be started.
That absolutely had to be started. And there are references in the Hebrew Scriptures. They say, look, he calls him Abba. That would have been very startling. And that probably, more than anything else that I see Jesus doing, would have really shaken people up. And I think no differently than a modern priest, rabbi, minister, or pastor today. I think that would have been startling. How dare he think he can call God Dad or Daddy?
You're familiar with Matthew Fox in the Roman Catholic Church. That's exactly what's going on. And they're trying to kick him out.
It's very difficult. We have been brought up in this, in our traditions, in our common traditions of respect and reverence. And then when you enter the sanctuary, it's with a hushed tone in voice and in heart. And the very idea of dad is just great.
In my Hebrew, I was told that Abba was father, Ima was mother.
Well, that's
so
wrong.
my teaching was wrong.
That's correct. It was wrong. The word for mother is M, and Ima is mom.
But when we're taking what we're saying about Jesus as Pharisee and so on and so forth, it's all been out of context more or less because he considered himself the Son of God.
I didn't say that.
I know.
Okay.
But when I'm hearing that you keep saying that who is he to dare to go beyond the Pharisees, but the Pharisees and the Sadducees were taking it from God, and Jesus considered himself the Son of God.
Okay.
According to Christian belief.
Okay.
So
All the more so would it have been starting
that
with the
would give
Pharisees.
him the authority. He's speaking for his Father rather than for himself.
Okay. Okay. The Pharisees, the Jews certainly would have reacted poorly to that. Yeah. If the two significant additions that Jesus makes, namely that he is above, that he is in authority above the others, and in that position can relate to God on this much more personal level than anything else. If those two are additions to his Gospels, it is interesting to look at the other way, to look at what he does not talk about. Now, some very interesting things that he does not talk about. For instance, he does not talk about the national and political situation of his day. Really, in the entire Gospel, one has no idea of the harsh oppression of the Roman occupation. You're aware of the Romans, but only tangentially, and only in the last day. Only then. Occasionally, a Roman centurion pops on the scene. But it's almost as if he's on leave from someplace. It's as if we're reading a story. It's as if we were to read a story written during early 1940s in Vichy, France, in occupied France. And the story tells about a teenager growing up and becoming a man and marrying and having children with not one mention of the Nazis in it. I mean, occupied France during the 40s was filled with the oppressive intrusion of the Nazi occupation. And to read a novel or a book about that time without mention of the Nazis would be startling. I find it startling that there is no mention of the Roman occupation. There is no significant statement in the Gospels about the land. In Jewish tradition, both before and afterwards, particularly in the Psalms and in the prophetic messages, there is an overriding, repetitious restatement of how important Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is. It's an overriding value. And yet there is no message of it in here. And finally, there is no mention at all of the central cult, the Jerusalem cult. Jesus goes to the temple, he overturns the tables of the money changers. But there is no statement about the significance of the cult. Now, to what do we attribute this surprising lack of three important factors? It seems to me that they are missing because it would have been counterproductive to present it to the audience that it was listening to. We have to remember that these Gospels are not written for Jews. These Gospels are written for believers. Believers outside of the land. Believers for which the land of Israel has little meaning except as the birthplace of the Messiah. Believers for whom the temple cult has totally lost its meaning, particularly because it's gone in the year 70. And for believers that are living within the Roman Empire, and it would have been counterproductive to talk about how terrible the Roman oppression was in their scriptural books when they were living in the midst of the Hellenistic world. That's just a side comment. But it's important to remember, because not only are we trying to figure out who Jesus is from the Gospels, we have to remember who these Gospels were written for. We cannot understand the text unless we understand who this text was written for. It's a very significant statement.
That is the opinion of the text Matthew addressed to the Jewish.
I don't believe it is, for a number of reasons. And we can go into it at some length further on, but let me just state a few. Matthew twists Hebrew Scripture. He takes a piece here and takes a piece here, twists them in order to get them together, and say, therefore Scripture is fulfilled. A Jew who was aware of the Hebrew Scripture he's taking it from would have caught it. Matthew writes in Greek, and he translates words. He'll talk about a place name in Judea, and then tell people where it was. If it was a Jewish audience, I assume they would know where it was. If it was a Jewish audience, he wouldn't have to translate what this term meant, a particularly Jewish term.
And what was the time frame of Matthew? He was later than Mark.
Mark is the first gospel written either just before the destruction of the temple in 70 or shortly thereafter.
And Matthew 300?
Matthew and Mark, no, not nearly that far. Matthew and Luke between 80 and 90. I've seen some people talk about Luke a little bit later than that. And John after that.
So the world they were addressing was not
Not a Jewish world. No. And it was a post-temple world.
No, wouldn't that account for the presentation of Christ as law, as the authority to say Jesus says, I know better than?
Yes, because history would say they're already gone, or at least the priests are.
So you cannot look at that as a direct quote. You cannot look at the statements you cited in Matthew as direct quotes.
Well, I didn't say anything were direct quotes. All I said was we're trying to take from the New Testament, from the Gospels, whatever we can to try and figure out where Jesus is talking from. I've never said, how do we know exactly what Jesus quoted? There are plenty of scholars that can decipher it all and say, he said this sentence, but he didn't say the other one. I'm not going to get into that. As far as for our discussion tonight, if Matthew said Jesus said it, okay.
All right, but if one accepts the idea of authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John,
right.
Somebody authored them, then it is important for the author to present the protagonist as
right.
knowing more.
Right.
Or,
of course,
right.
and that's why. That's why Jesus. Right. Okay, I see what you're saying, and I agree with that.
I just wondered if the scholars have found proof that Jesus ever existed, or I think there was a time when these books were written, long after the crucifixion, the so-called crucifixion, or is he entirely a creation of the writers of the books of the New Testament?
I don't know of any reputable scholar that says that Jesus did not exist. I don't know of any reputable scholar that says that Jesus was not some kind of a Jewish leader crucified in Jerusalem in the reign of Pilate around the year 30, 32, 33. I don't know of any reputable scholar that denies that. And that's perfectly all right with me. The question is what kind of Jewish leader. Now, if Jesus draws on Phariseeism and takes it a step beyond, a good example of that is a quote by a scholar that Jesus, I assume, would have known about. In the generation immediately preceding Jesus, the chief Jewish scholar was a man named Hillel. And there is a story about Hillel in which a prospective proselyte comes to the door, bangs on his door, and says to Hillel, "Teach me all that's in Torah while standing on one foot." Now, it's not clear from the text whether the proselyte means while I stand on one foot or while you, Hillel, stand on one foot, but I don't think that makes any difference. Teach me all that there is in Torah while standing on one foot. Hillel's response is very simple. Don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself. The rest is commentary on the Torah, and only commentary on the Torah. Now go and study. Jesus is asked a similar question. What's the most important thing? And Jesus' response is, do unto others what you would like done to yourself, or as you would like others to do to you. Now, I want to contrast those two statements. Hillel says the negative. Don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself. Jesus says the positive. Do to others what you want done to yourself. I believe that Jesus was aware of Hillel's statement. And typical of of Jesus' ministry was that he took Pharisaic Judaism, the truth that he felt there, and gave it his own spin. And I think that, I would say, sincerely his own spin. He's not creating something new. But what's the difference in saying, don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself, and do to others what you want done to yourself? I do this with our kids at school when we talk about this. Imagine a person, it's much easier when you're 13 or 14. Imagine a person that you hate and detest and can't even stand to look at. Someone who comes in contact with you and your first response is to turn around and walk away. Imagine that person in your mind. And now I tell you, do to him what you would like done to you. Go up to him and say, would you like to have lunch with me at school today? Let's go to a movie on Friday night. Got a basketball game coming up. How about if I pick you up? That's what you'd like somebody else to say to you. So I want you to go and do it to them. Now tell me what you're going to do. And the kids say, no way. I say, why not? Well, I have nothing to do with him. Hillel's response, don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself. I say to the 13-year-old now, think about this person you hate. You detest him. What is the minimum that ought to be required of you? As a person, as a good person. Well, the minimum that ought to be required of me is that I don't gossip about this person. I don't hurt him. I don't damage him. I don't have to talk to him, but I shouldn't hurt him. That's what you should expect from him, and that's what you should expect about yourself for him. Hillel is giving a value statement, a way of living that is immediately practical. Yes, it is possible for me to hold my children responsible for not hurting someone else. And yes, God holds me responsible for not hurting someone else. But what is it that Jesus asks? Jesus asks, from a Jewish perspective anyway, he asks the impossible. It's impossible. I cannot treat other people that I hate the way I would like to be treated. It is not possible. Why then does Jesus take the Pharisaic tradition and give it the spin? Why does he make a statement that is, as he says, the highest of the commandments? Why does he make the statement knowing it is impossible? Jesus has stepped outside of Pharisaic tradition with himself as the ultimate authority. And Jesus' theological perspective is, you cannot behave properly on your own. You cannot behave properly on your own. You need an extra boost, divine boost, in order to behave absolutely properly. Jesus has I have a quote here. I wrote it, and I wrote it so well, and it's too good not to say. Jesus speaks with singular authority to declare that perfect behavior is expected. Perfect behavior is expected. It's not a Pharisaic idea. And there is an implicit declaration there, and the implicit declaration is that extra-personal behavior, that extra-personal control is necessary, and that also is not a Pharisaic idea. Because the Pharisees said, you can do what God wants you to do. It is possible. Pharisaic Judaism wanted God to follow a set collection of laws. And they were all laid out, and the Pharisees said, here are the rules, you can follow them. Because it was a closed and finite collection. Jesus said, God wants you to follow a perfect pattern of God, or a perfect pattern of Christ. And because it is perfect, we will always fall short. And so it's possible only with God's extra help. Or, as a church would say today, only with Christ in you is one able, with Christ in one, is one able to live that perfect life. because left on our own we can't. Jesus has removed himself from Pharisaic perspective in not only declaring himself an authority above the Pharisees and above Torah, but he is also stating that in his hand he has the vehicle through which you can become perfect. You can live a perfect life. It is there within you. And it is with that focus that he no longer is a Pharisee, but becomes that figure after resurrection, that enabler that allows someone to become perfect, or at least to have the potential of being perfect in Christ, as the expression goes. Now, there are some, we're going to do a little rabbinic Torah study. What I have here, there are 2 sheets of paper, but we're going to look at specifically some quotes from New Testament and see their reflection in rabbinic literature. When I say, there's one sheet, but it's 2-sided. Yes, please pass them. Okay. When I say that Jesus is speaking out of rabbinic tradition, this is my demonstration of it. I was sort of a little slipshod before. I mean, I said it, and I just assumed that because I'm standing in front that you're going to believe me. But it's not that simple. I want you to believe me because Jesus is drawing on rabbinic tradition. The quotes that are here are contemporaneous with Jesus. And it's possible, and I wouldn't even argue with saying that maybe Jesus came up with this interpretation first, and it was adapted by the Pharisees. I'm not even bothered by that, because what it means is that they are within the same community. And whether Jesus was the initiator of the Sabbath statement, for instance, which is where we're going to start, or the Pharisees is really immaterial, because it identifies Jesus as part of that community. So on the first page, it says the sanctity of the Sabbath is the quote that we read with its parallel quotes in Matthew and Luke about the Sabbath, plucking ears. And the major statement, of course, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Second paragraph now. Everybody have it? Good. In a Midrash commentary, Midrash is rabbinic legend that explains law. That's easy definition, but close. In the Midrash commentary to Exodus 31:14, you shall keep the Sabbath. The Hebrew is ushmartem. You shall guard the Sabbath. Here's what we find in the Midrash. This is what was meant when Rabbi Shimon, the son of Mamsi, said, the Sabbath is handed over to you, rather than you are handed to the Sabbath. You see, the statement in Leviticus, in Exodus said, you will guard the Sabbath. What does that mean, guard? It means you protect it. You control it. In other words, the Sabbath is in your hand, rather than you are within the laws of the Sabbath. And it's almost a direct quote. The Sabbath is handed over to you rather than you are handed over to the Sabbath. Almost an exact quote that we find in the three synoptic Gospels. In this quote from John in the middle of the page, Jesus answered them, I did one deed and you all marveled at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it was from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man upon the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. The argument is this. Jesus heals on the Sabbath. And the Jews come to him. In John, they're called the Jews. The Jews come to him and say, how can you do this labor on the Sabbath? You healed a man. That's labor. You can't do this on the Sabbath. Jesus' response is, good response, if on the Sabbath we can do a circumcision, Jewish boys are circumcised on the 8th day, no matter what that 8th day is. If it's the 8th day, you do it. Unless the baby is ill. Then you don't. You wait. But assuming a healthy baby, even on the Sabbath you circumcise. Jesus says, if you can circumcise on the Sabbath, which isn't treating an illness, which isn't making somebody feel better, how can you tell me that I can't heal a person who is in danger on the Sabbath? Do you understand the argument? It's a good argument. Of course it's good. Jewish. Rabbi Eliezer answered. This is a quote from Talmud, from Yoma Talmud. Rabbi Eliezer answered and said, if circumcision, which is concerned with only one part of the 248 members of the human body, suspends the Sabbath, since circumcision takes place on the 8th day after birth, even if a Sabbath or a festival, and invokes surgery and preparations which normally violate Sabbath law, and how much the more so shall the saving of a whole body suspend the Sabbath requirements? Exactly the same thing that Jesus says.
Now, was that said after he said that?
All right, the problem with the quote from Yoma is that this statement comes from the year past 200. So we don't know. Rabbi Eliezer is a few years after Jesus, but that same generation. I don't know if Eliezer really said that, whether they're taking that statement and putting it back on Eliezer, but it certainly is reflective of Jewish tradition as it is finally recorded in the year 200. So, and that's why I'm saying...
He might have been just repeating a story that he had heard prior.
Yes, I'm saying there's one of two possibilities. He is repeating what was already Pharisaic tradition, or he makes this statement, and it is then picked up by Pharisaic tradition as being true. Either way, I'm comfortable with, because it means they're in the same community. Okay, now we've got the part 3 here. Note that Mark's version of the healing of the paralytic, found in Mark, you can look up on your own, concludes with the famous statement, I say to you, rise, take up your bed, and go home. In other synoptics, the story is repeated, but without the dramatic, take up your bed. Now, you need to look in your Bibles at this story yourself. But when the incident is reported in John's Gospel, it takes place on the Sabbath. In John, the conflict between Jesus and the Jews is not one of healing on the Sabbath, but that Jesus told the man, take up your bed and walk. Because picking up, carrying things on the Sabbath is a violation. John apparently did not think that the Jews would be bothered by Sabbath healing. Instead, he insists that it's because Jesus called for breaking the Sabbath by carrying this. The violation and the presumptiveness was why the Jews sought to kill him the more. So in John's Gospel, we have the statement that the Jews weren't bothered by his healing on the Sabbath, but that Jesus said, pick up your pallet, pick up your bed, and go.
Why did, in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, the ancient Hebrews were identified as Sadducees or Pharisees, and John simply says, the Jews?
John does not use, for the most part, Pharisees and Sadducees or elders or scribes. He just talks about the Jews. The Jews are bad.
In John's Gospel.
In John's Gospel. There's one statement, this doesn't answer your question, but as long as you brought up John. In John 7 or 8, I think, I'm not sure, John has Jesus say to the Jews, you think your father is Abraham, but your father is not Abraham. Your father is Satan. My father is Abraham. And you Jews who think you're doing the right thing, think you're following the tradition of your fathers, you are. You're following the traditions of Satan. And it's the Jews that are cast into this very negative light. Why John does this, there has been a lot of speculation. Has been a lot written that John is the most anti-Semitic of all the gospel writers. That all the Jews are bad. And by using this generic term, in fact, you could read the book of John and not even realize that Jesus was Jewish. He goes out of his way to put down the fact that Jesus was Jewish. And you read, if you only have John, it's Jesus and the Jews, and so you assume Jesus isn't Jewish. Lately, there has been some very good scholarship that says that John did not mean Jews, he means Judeans. He's talking about a national group as opposed to a religious group. And that John cannot distinguish between Pharisees and Sadducees. He's writing 20 to 30 years after there are no more Sadducees altogether, the temple is gone. And that John simply uses Judeans and it's not meant as a religious term, it's meant as a national term. Now that's a little bit better. But it's true that John does that, and John's gospel is the basis, the focus of a lot of very interesting scholarship, Jewish Christian scholarship.
Who was John? We don't know.
The Gospel of John Widespread is very interesting. It's supposed to be a response to the early Gnostic church, against the early Gnostic church. Do you want to say something, Bruce?
Huh?
Do you want to say something?
No, I said,
Turn the page over. This is my favorite of all of them. And we looked at it a minute ago. When questioned by the Pharisees and the scribes, we're not quite sure who the scribes were, we assume they're Pharisees, about why his followers do not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with hands defiled, since they did not wash before eating, Jesus concludes his rebuttal with the famous statement, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside of a man which by going into him can defile him, but the things which came out of a man are what defile him." Now that we saw. Now look at this quote. Hillel is before Jesus, is the generation just before Jesus. The school of Hillel and the school of Shammai argue in the Mishnah about the order of hand washing. And their statements are carried into the Gemara of the Talmud for a more detailed discussion. Shammai declares that the hands are to be washed before the Kiddush cup is filled. And Hillel states just the opposite. Kiddush cup is the wine cup, for the wine blessing. So Shammai says you wash your hands, then pick up the Kiddush cup and fill it. Hillel says you fill the Kiddush cup, pick up the Kiddush cup, fill it, then you wash your hands. Now listen to their arguments. In his argument against Hillel, Shammai insists that if the hands are washed first, as Hillel wanted, they will become defiled as you pick up this cup, because the cup isn't clean on the outside. Who knows where it's been? Hillel simply responds, a vessel does not make a man unclean. Just by touching this vessel that's been in the cupboard, that's not going to make you unclean. To which Shammai questions, but would not the cup render unclean the liquid inside it? And the Gemara concludes by completely justifying Hillel's position. The Gemara is the year 500. We are here dealing with a vessel, the outside of which has been rendered unclean by liquid, in which case its inside is clean and its outside unclean. As we have learned, if the outside of a vessel has been rendered unclean by liquids, its outside is unclean, while its inside, its rim, its handle, its half are clean. If its inside have been rendered unclean, it is all unclean. The rabbi said, no matter what the outside of the vessel is, the inside is going to be clean, if it is clean. But if the inside is clean, unclean, doesn't matter how you do the outside, the whole thing's going to be unclean, which is exactly what Jesus said. And this is a debate from Hillel and Shammai, which is the generation before Jesus. So, one of the theories, when we have Jesus arguing with the Pharisees about this clean and unclean, there's a whole book written that says when Jesus argues with the Pharisees, he's arguing with Shammai Pharisees. But he's a Hillel Pharisee. This would be supported by this. He's a Hillel Pharisee, and when he's talking about those terrible Pharisees, he's talking about the terrible Pharisees that follow the school of Shammai, which were competing schools in Jesus' generation.
Is that something that a young man of his time would learn in school?
Yes. Yes. Hillel and Shammai is where you start to discuss rabbinic law, because they are the first great scholars just before, about the year 0. And so when you discuss rabbinic logic and argument, any student would start with Hillel and Shammai. And Hillel, for the most part, is the most liberal, almost always the most liberal, and Hillel is the one who is followed. And so it would also make sense if Jesus was a follower of Hillel, because he's not only liberal, he takes liberality to the extreme, which is what I'm saying is placing him outside. So it would make sense that he's a follower of Hillel.
So the people of that day, when you're talking about the difference between Sadducees and Pharisees, was it an either-or proposition? We either believed totally in what the Pharisees were saying, or the Sadducees, or did people believe, some of both, and pick and choose, that kind of thing?
The Sadducees, the priests, had the monopoly of the temple. Whether you liked what they were doing or not, whether you agreed with their legal opinions, They were the priests that officiated at the temple, and you took your offerings to them. And you were required to do that. What the Pharisees said was, yes, go do your stuff over there. But we'll tell you what you do on the Sabbath. We'll tell you what food to eat and how to wash your hands. We'll tell you how to structure your life outside of the grain offering at the first fruits of the harvest, which you have to take to the Sadducees. So the Pharisees would never deprecate the role of the Sadducees, of the priests. They would never say, don't go to them. They would say, you have to go to them. But we're the ones that tell you how to live. The ritual for the offerings are there. The way to live your life is here.
So would a child of that day have, was there any kind of a system where a child would have gone and learned, from the Pharisees? Probably.
At the time of Jesus, the Pharisaic movement was the popular movement. That was where, well, anybody can become a Pharisee, a scholar. The only people that become a priest, a Sadducee, is if you're born into that family. So in terms of popular common roots, the Pharisees grew right out of the common folk, because anybody could become one. All you needed were smarts and a willingness to engage in it. So the Pharisees became the most popular, and probably the majority of the people would have had Pharisaic leanings. They would have affirmed what the Pharisees were saying. For the most part, the people who are affirming Sadducean-only leadership is their own group.
Really, the Pharisees believed in the Sadducees and then beyond that.
Yes. Right. Right.
Was the rabbinical tradition beginning here? Do we have rabbis leading discussions?
Okay, good question. If we follow the Pharisees from their nebulous beginnings in Babylon to their firm statement in 150, and we go to 0, we pick up Jesus as a Pharisee, pass the crucifixion, and get to the year 70, destruction of the temple. When the temple is destroyed, there are no more Sadducees. They're out of work. There's no more temple. So there are no more parushim, opponents, separatists. They are left as the only game in town. And this Pharisaic line that starts here and goes to 70, on the other side of 70, they're called rabbis.
They weren't before?
They weren't called rabbis before. Teachers. But the title of rabbi does not appear until after the temple is destroyed.
Is that because it took a more religious connotation or a more sacred connotation?
I don't know. I think it just developed along the times. Whatever the culture was, however it occurred post-70. But it's reasonable that it occurred post-70 because it doesn't make any sense to talk about Pharisee separatists when there's nobody to separate them from.
I find that unusual because every group needs leadership, organization, structure of some kind. And it just doesn't happen.
Well, okay, the term Rav means great. And there were probably titles, Harav, the great one. The leader of a particular school might have been called Harav. And then Ravi becomes my high leader, which becomes in English Rabbi.
So there was...
Yeah, I mean, I can see how it would have developed, and it's not unusual that it developed, but it becomes a formal title with a capital R, for instance, in English, as a capital title, as opposed to as Mr. and Mr. Mr. with a small m is not the same as capital M, Mr. Capital M, Mr. becomes a title.
And then as the relative of Rav, you have Rov,
Rov,
which means majority.
yes, meaning great, meaning the greatest part of the group. Rov means, and in Hebrew it can also mean many. It can mean multitude, but in this case it can mean the highest or the leader. But yeah, it's that same root. It has many derivatives. That's right.
Would it be wrong to think that there was a kind of a civil war among the Jews after 70?
Not after 70. After 70, the only ones that are left with any authority and with any structure and organization are the Pharisees, now rabbis. Nobody else is left with any kind of a structure. The Pharisees are gone. The splinter groups are all destroyed. The only one with an organization equipped to respond after 70 are the Pharisees. And they're the only ones left.
The Romans were thorough.
Yes. Yes.
Getting back to the laws, of the over 600 laws, what was the time span of the writing of those and who wrote them and so on?
Well, if you're referring to the 613 laws that are contained in Torah, that goes to Ezra. Ezra, in the year 440, 450, brings a written text
Oh, okay.
that's declared Torah. Now, that number 613 appears much later. It's the rabbis that say, how they counted them, I don't know. But it's the rabbis that say there are 613 laws in Torah. When I said that Hillel's statement of don't do to others what you want done to yourself, in that there is a definitive behavior mode, that's what I'm talking about. It's the Pharisees who said there are 613 laws, learn them and do them. It's possible. Just learn them and do them. And that's why they were so specific in saying there are 613 laws. It's not vague, and it's not perfection. There are certain behavior laws. I expect my kids to do certain things. I tell them what I expect, and I expect them to do it. Now, they're not perfect children, but they're supposed to do these things. So Jewish tradition says, I know you're not perfect, you're people, but I expect you to do these things. Jesus' response is, you should be, God wants you to be perfect. And I have, or God has through me, given you the ability to achieve that perfection and potential at least. And it's through that potentiality, it's with that potentiality that Paul then says, and that's where we go next week, that Paul says, here it is, and here's how it works. Jesus does not say, here's how it works. Paul does. And Paul is affirming it from within a Jewish perspective, which is very interesting. If Jesus has left Pharisaic Judaism, and all these things are beyond Pharisaic Judaism, how can Paul say they are all coming right out of Judaism? And yet he does say that. And so it will be interesting next week to look at Paul's quotes and see how, in fact, he does that. From a perspective of a Jew.
In those days, could a person grow up through childhood and to early adulthood in the general stream of life and then become a Pharisee? Or would they be?
Sure.
So it's possible that a person could be born in a manger from a Virgin Mary and still become a Pharisee.
If I believed that a person could be born of a virgin, I think I'd be sitting there listening to some rabbi talk. Yeah.
Would you just place the scenes in the historic perspective before they fit into the general period of time?
The Essene.
What was their impact, especially on the theology of evolution?
The Essenes are destroyed by Roman 70. We have a terminal point. They probably have about 150-year lifespan. Probably. Sometime after the year 200 BCE, they remove themselves from the Jerusalem community. And there is an ongoing debate over whether they were Sadducees or Pharisees. And very interesting argument, because there are good points on both sides. Whether they remove themselves from the Pharisees or remove themselves from the Sadducees because they don't like what the groups are doing. They develop their own philosophy. They see themselves as the righteous of God, and have removed themselves from society in order to protect their purity. And they're gone with the Roman destruction. Rome destroys their community as well. Now, the only way we know about them is that Josephus, who is a writer writing on either side of the year 70, Josephus describes them. He's really our only source on the Essenes. And it appears that the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls were Essenes. But I'm not so sure. Close maybe, but I'm not so sure.
John the Baptist, for instance?
John could very well have been an Essene. Came up last week. Could very well have been an Essene.
Wasn't there some things that Jesus did that were Essene in nature, the number of his disciples and so on?
No, I don't know of anything he did was... He has 12 disciples. That shouldn't surprise anybody. There are 12 tribes. He says the disciples will be in charge. Well, I mean, we've got 12 tribes. That's the way Torah is set up. So that doesn't surprise me at all. I don't know of anything that Jesus does that is particularly a sin. Particularly a sin. In fact, you can see a lot of the things that he did that violated the Essenes, particularly in terms of purity and in terms of setting himself up as authority.
Were the Essenes partially Nazarites?
I doubt it. I don't think so. Well, maybe next week it'll be warmer. And next week we'll do Paul and